the conceptualization and theorizing of diaconal methodology in the context of trauma. With advances in trauma studies over the past 30 years, we now know that trauma is one of the most pervasive and widespread causes of broken relationships, estrangement, and suffering. A traumatized world is in need of reconciliation. What has diaconia to do with trauma? Reconciliation and diaconia. If, as Paul claimed, God has given us the ministry, diaconium, of reconciliation, then the work of reconciliation and repair among individuals and within communities broken by trauma is central to the diaconal vocation of all Christians. This is confirmed in the 2022 document called to Transformation. We cannot understand or practice diaconia apart from justice and peace. Service cannot be separated from prophetic witness or the ministry of reconciliation. And I would add, nor can reconciliation be separated from service and justice. It is all too common for persons who are not in the position of the oppressed to want to rush to reconciliation before attending to the hurt and injustice. Diaconal theology and praxis provides tools for this difficult work toward reconciliation. Tools of ecumenical diaconia. Two important tools have arisen for contemporary diaconal methodology. Diapraxis, when Christians partner with persons of many faiths or of no faith to achieve common goals through dialogue and action. And conviviality, the art and practice of living together based on relationality, respect of difference among persons and communities, and reciprocal relationships. In this presentation, I argue for adding a third tool, trauma-informed ethics. Changing the question. In this presentation, I explore the points of connection between trauma-informed response and diaconal praxis, particularly as conceptualized through the notion of conviviality. Where conviviality begins with the question, how can we live together? I suggest that a trauma-informed approach begins with the question, how can we live together in the aftermath of trauma? Building on a model of trauma-informed ethics that I have previously developed, I adopt an interdisciplinary approach to diaconal theology and praxis, drawing on trauma studies, practical theology, and ethics. I argue that a liberative, trauma-informed response resonates strongly with diaconal commitments and is a necessary partner to diaconal theology and praxis in today's world. Trauma and trauma-informed response, healing and recovery. Trauma begins with an event that overwhelms one's sense of safety and agency. However, trauma does not end when the danger has subsided. Effects of trauma. Trauma is characterized by lasting effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. These effects impair a person's relationships with their immediate environment, loved ones, community, self, and God. It is notable that SAMHSA, an agency of the US federal government, identifies spiritual disruption as a characteristic of trauma. Spirituality in this context is presented as an aspect of the universal human experience. Trauma and healing. Judith Herman offered 4 stages of trauma healing and recovery. Overcoming relational barriers, such as shame and secrecy. Safety, both physical and through connection with others. Reconstruction of personal narrative, and reconnection and restoration to community. Trauma-informed response. More recently, SAMHSA identified the 4 R's of trauma-informed response. realize how widespread trauma is, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, respond by integrating knowledge into practice, and resist doing further harm. Helping the helpless. One ethical conundrum in trauma-informed response is the extent to which we attribute agency to the victim. Is our support for victims an exercise in helping the helpless? Judith Herman emphasized the traumatized person's sense of helplessness in the face of existential threat. Christian ethicist Tracy West coined the term victim survivor to emphasize the traumatized person's agency and internal resources. Diaconal method emphasizes dignity and empowerment, honoring and enhancing the agency of suffering persons. Ethics of trauma-informed response. My ethical model is centered on the concept of bearing witness. To bear witness is to attest to the truth of another person's story and to act upon it. How shall we bear witness to someone else's suffering, especially traumatic suffering? Bearing witness to victim survivors. This model correlates Samsa's 4 R's of trauma-informed response and Herman's stages of recovery with modes of human transcendence identified by process theologian Marjorie Suhaki. Empathy, memory, and imagination are rooted in the universal human experience, allowing us to make meaning in temporal dimensions, past, present, and future, as well as recognition of each other's shared humanity. Of course, this chart is artificially heuristic. In practice, these perspectival moments are intermingled and do not occur in orderly fashion. But what I'm intending to do here is to align different modes of transcendence with trauma-informed response and Herman's model of healing and recovery. Then I'm going to connect that to diaconal theology and method. It's important to note the universality of the themes in this chart. Suffering knows no creed. The perspectival moments and corresponding modes of transcendence are rooted in the human experience as such. Thus, this model of bearing witness is well suited to responsible interfaith encounter, diapraxis, and community building, conviviality, as well as the specific commitments of ecumenical diaconia. Diaconal methodology and praxis. Bearing witness, as I have described it, has many points of resonance with the methodology and praxis of ecumenical diaconia. Evolution of ecumenical diaconia. Ecumenical diaconia is currently undergoing a rebirth, no longer focused primarily on individual acts of mercy or on support for secular economic development. Ecumenical diaconia now claims a responsibility to respond to oppressive social structures through solidarity and empowerment. Thus, scholars note a paradigm shift toward a more ecclesial, holistic, and prophetic practice of diaconia, moving from humble service model to solidarity with the oppressed. Diaconal values. Ecumenical diaconia upholds core values of love, justice, and solidarity. These values were evident in the work of United Methodist deaconesses, whom I interviewed in 2019. Deaconesses in the United Methodist Church are mandated to alleviate suffering, eradicate causes of injustice, and to develop full human potential and build global community. These diaconal values and actions are all built on the premise of human dignity. Every person is a child of God, loved by God. And as we prayed at the beginning of this meeting, we are all made in the image of God. So dignity, love, justice, and solidarity are the moral themes I see running through diaconia. Ecumenical diaconia today is contextual. It aims to alleviate suffering. It is rights-based. It involves an analysis of power structures and is ultimately action-oriented. Diaconal methodology. Ecumenical diaconia involves an intentional cycle of action, theory, and reflection, mutually reinforcing and deepening our understanding of ourselves and our actions in light of God's continuing action in the world. The Lutheran World Federation described liberative diaconal methodology as see, reflect, act, a process that privileges the perspective of the poor and marginalized. It employs a hermeneutics of suspicion about power and privilege and promotes wide participation and empowerment. Ecumenical diaconia is therefore a political theology in the most profound sense, motivating and theorizing the work of discipleship through contextual awareness of social structures and a sense of justice to transform and reshape power. This work requires alliance building within communities. A liberative praxis. It is no exaggeration to describe today's ecumenical diaconia as rooted in liberation theology, as noted by Craig Messon and others. Diaconal action thus includes care for creation and commitment to promote human dignity and justice, in solidarity with the poor and excluded, working with all people of goodwill. Solidarity with the poor is a primary commitment. Most North American diaconal actors are not poor, though, and attempts at solidarity are laden with power differentials. How can persons of relative privilege participate in a liberative praxis? Trauma-informed diaconia. Bearing witness to victim survivors of trauma is one way that Christians of relative privilege can live out their call to the diaconate. Bearing witness to victim survivors. My ethical model takes into account asymmetrical power relations. This ethic is designed for the person bearing witness to a traumatized person. The framework helps the diaconal actor move through increasingly complex moral themes and practices of social action with the aim of meaningful participation in community as one in solidarity with the suffering, oppressed, and marginalized. From a diaconal perspective, recognition of human dignity and equality is our starting point, expressed through support for human rights. Empathetic love emanates from the greatest commandment, expressed through service and acts of mercy, providing for basic human needs. The transcendent mode of memory enables us to attend to justice, including truth-telling and analysis of social structures of oppression. When we imaginatively view the world through the kingdom lens, we can join in solidarity with victim survivors of trauma and others who are oppressed and marginalized. Diaconal praxis thus aims for empowerment and community building, and ultimately to reconnection, restoration, and eventually reconciliation. A call to provoke. Called to transformation describes the diaconia as a call, vocatio, that at times includes advocacy, advocatio, and provocation, provocatio. If diaconia is indeed provocative, calling into being new ways of seeing, judging, and acting, how might we ensure that this provocation contributes to healing and recovery after trauma? A liberative, trauma-informed praxis of diaconia aims to see, judge, and act in ways that contribute to the flourishing of victim survivors. for their good, the human community, and all of creation. Provoking the flourishing of all. A liberative, trauma-informed praxis of diaconia aims to see, judge, and act, this is my conclusion, in ways that contribute to the flourishing of victim survivors, for their good, the human community, and all of creation.
Thank you, Darryl. I'm going to call on Karen Douglas to say a few words of thanks and appreciation for your presentation.
Hello, folks. Thank you, Darryl, for stimulating our imaginations and our intellects. It's sometimes when I have, for me anyway, I have my nose down in the practice of ministry, I don't step back to theorize very often. So I appreciate the words stumbling there across the screen and a chance to think theoretically. I think you've laid the groundwork for us to unpack our own experiences with words that resonate with things we encounter in the work that we're doing across all the different ways that we express diaconia. So thank you for providing that. And clearly you are a very learned person who's thought a lot about this. So I appreciate you sharing your ideas with us. I can't wait to talk about them.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Darryl. I just would say ditto to what Karen said. And I'm going to send